Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. Nice to be with you.
Good to have you. Thanks for making the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Bruce Feiler, well-known writer, author of a number of books, including the mega bestseller Walking the Bible some years ago. More recently, Council of Dads, which was turned into an actual NBC TV show, which is more than I can say for any of my books. But neither of those books is what we're here to talk about. You are the author of the brand new book, Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age, which is good because that covers my age group. There it is. You're holding it up. Hold it up right in the middle so that it obscures your face. Be selfless about it. There you go. That's the book. Nice looking jacket. Nice, very alluring title. And we have a lot to talk about. Before we get to that, because this is, I think, relevant in a way that we will eventually come to, but you are also the author of the Feiler Faster thesis. And I'm proud to say that I was present at the creation of the Feiler Faster thesis. Is that consistent with your recollection?
That is consistent with my recollection. In fact, as we get started here, I feel obliged to point out that this is risky, that you and I have known each other for 25 years.
That was risky, but you pulled it off. I think we got through that.
Well, what's risky is that what I was going to say was I know that it's counter to your reputation as someone who punctures pretension and abhors sentimentality, but you're actually a very good friend, and I'm concerned that I will ruin your reputation.
Don't get mushy. But yes, I do consider us good friends. I've known you like a long time. I met you at a party in D.C. when you were an up-and-coming writer. I think you had just published a book called Learning to Bow that had been very well reviewed in the New York Times about your time in Japan. And you've impressed me since then as being like a writer's writer. I mean, you go out and you do stuff and you write about it. You became a clown in a circus for a while, wrote about that. You followed Garth Brooks around and wrote about country music. You wrote about NASCAR, didn't you? Or did you write about NASCAR? No, you just know NASCAR by virtue of your Southern heritage or something?
I come from the South. There was a time where that book on country music was going to be a book about country music, NASCAR, and barbecue, and it became a book about country music.
That's it.
And we do have that South, in my case, Southwest thing in your case, in common.
That's how well I know you. I not only know your books, I know what books might have been. And in fact, I think I now recall a lunch with you that may coincide with kind of the first stirrings of this book. I remember you talking about the importance of stories.
Yeah.
And we talked about the radio show The Moth. Yeah. And this was some years ago, and stories become an important part of this book, the importance of stories. You think that we are not doing enough storytelling in a certain sense. That I guess we can come to eventually, unless you want to say something about it now.
It does seem preposterous in this moment where tell your story has been a kind of badge of contemporary life for a while, that a certain kind of storytelling isn't happening. But yes, I do believe that. But before we get into that, I will go back. Yes, in 2000, it was in February of 2000, you and I went to see our mutual friend Mickey Kaus do a reading at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side. And it was between the New Hampshire primary and the South Carolina primary that became the last stand of George W. Bush over John McCain. And we went to have dinner at a restaurant that just went defunct last week. We just were tweeting about this. And that's where I sort of had this idea that we were in a world where change was happening faster, information was coming at us more quickly, and that people would process the McCain win in New Hampshire and Bush would be able to hold him back in South Carolina because we just move through information in life a lot quicker. Right. And what is actually interesting is how that idea that Mickey then coined the Feiler Faster thesis credited me to his credit. In a way that is actually, in its own way, an underpinning for kind of the idea that I talk about in this book, which is that life is coming at us faster and we have a lot more transitions to go through in our lives.
That's right. I remember, well, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Sarah and Barry, were there, I think. And Mickey named it Feiler Faster Thesis. Now I think it has its own Wikipedia entry. Let's get to the relevance of it right away.
Right.
I mean, one argument you make in the book is that we are living in a nonlinear age. And that has something to do with the pace of change. Tell us, what you mean by nonlinear age.
So let me just walk through a little bit of the backstory because it brings up the storytelling and the nonlinear at the same time. So what happened to me, I mean, you were kind enough to exaggerate my life story a little bit, but I lived what I now think of as a linear life. I grew up in Georgia. In my 20s, went off and entered various cultures, Japan, country music, the circus. But I discovered very early on in my life what I wanted to do with my life. I did it for no money for a while. I had some success in my 30s. You mentioned Walking the Bible and a whole series of books and TV shows. I got married and I had children. But then in my 40s, I had a back-to-back non-linear series of events. I basically got walloped by life. And I got cancer, as you mentioned, that became Council of Dads. I almost went bankrupt in the Great Recession. But the sort of searing event of all of this was that my dad, who has Parkinson's, tried, Parkinson's affects your movement, but it's fundamentally a dopamine disease and it affects your mood too. And so he got very depressed and tried to kill himself 6 times in 12 weeks. So in the middle of this, we were dealing with family and medical and business. It's a family business here. But I'm the story guy. I'm the meaning guy. So on a whim, on a Monday morning, I send my dad a question about his life. Tell me about the toys you played with as a kid. And he couldn't even move his fingers at this time, Bob. And he dictated his answers to Siri and spit it out. And then he edited it with my mom. And then I sent another one. Tell me about the house you grew up in. Tell me, how'd you join the Navy? How'd you become an Eagle Scout? How'd you meet Mom? And he backed in to writing. This man who'd never written anything longer than a memo, he backed into writing an autobiography. This went on for 5 years, and kind of the way I lived my life, I thought I should write about this. But unlike the way I lived my life, I got totally stuck because I couldn't figure out whether it was the story of storytelling or the story of my dad or my story or kind of whatever it was. And yes, this was happening in a moment when storytelling was kind of catching hold. You've got The Moth, you've got Humans of New York, you had StoryCorps, but these were all a certain kind of storytelling, kind of short, episodic, ways of telling story. But it turns out there's an entire academic field called narrative gerontology. Narrative adolescence was just being founded at that time. Narrative medicine was just getting going. But I couldn't figure out what to do. And so I put it aside and I did another book. And what happened was that a couple years later, I went to my 30th college reunion, actually, and I was moderating a panel. This is in New Haven. I was moderating a panel of the Yale class of 87, and I had all these prominent classmates. And on the way up, the person who was driving with me just had a horrific experience. He was closing a big real estate deal, and his partner had a 9-month-old who went down for a nap and never woke up. And so I just had the story in my head, and I was in front of all these people, and I had all the resumes of these very impressive people, and I just couldn't do it. I just literally couldn't do it. So I ripped them up. And I said, look, losers don't come to their college reunion. I don't want to hear about your success. I want to hear about your struggles. And that night, person after person came up to me and said, had a similar story, basically. Like, my wife had a headache and went to the hospital and died. My boss is trying to steal from me. I'm being sued for malpractice. Somebody else was saying, I just got diagnosed with, my brother got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer or whatever it was. And what everybody was saying was like, the life I'm living is not the life I expected. I'm living life out of order in some way. And that was sort of the first sense that there was something kind of nonlinear, some disconnect between how people were living and how they thought they should be living. And I called my wife, Linda, and I said, look, no one knows how to tell their story anymore. I've got to figure out what to do. And that led me off on this journey across the country, collecting what became hundreds of life stories of Americans in all 50 states, people who lost homes and lost limbs, changed careers, changed genders, got out of cults, got out of hate groups, got sober. And then I had a whole team of people, and I did something I'd never done in 30 years of writing books, is that we spent a year coding these stories and debating them and having these murder boards, as I called them, around my office. And the big idea that emerged now answers your question with that backstory, which is that the idea of a linear life, that you're going to have one home, one job, one relationship, one spirituality, one source of happiness. Like, this is how we were all raised, and this is deader than it's ever been. And it's been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life, which is a life with many more twists and turns and ups and downs and an entirely different shape than we expect.
Okay. So now this feeling that these, your fellow your Yale classmates had, and various people you interview in the book express well, things being, their lives having turned out not like they expected. They're in a period of greater flux than they might have anticipated, including often like tremendous sorrow. There was a time when in the history of kind of the literature that your book is part of, when, that kind of feeling was thought of as an almost predictable phase at a certain part in life. And you might give it a name like the midlife crisis. As you write about in the book, the book Passages by Gail Sheehy kind of memorialized this idea, and more broadly the idea that there is this, you're going through your 20s, you got your 20s crisis, your 30s, however she put it. I didn't read the book, but that's an idea, that would be a linear approach to human problems, right? Well, this is the problem for this stage of life. And I think you're saying two things. First of all, she wasn't quite right in the first place, even back then, right? You're saying that, but you're also saying that she's become even less right because the texture and kind of logic of life has changed.
So for me, okay, so let's geek out on the science and the history, right? Because this is something that we share, and I'm thinking about your book on the history of God right now. I mean, which goes way back in time and talks about this idea, right? So what I want to say is that for me, the kind of intellectual underpinning, I felt like one of these days I pulled a book off a shelf and the bookcase opened and I was in a different room that I didn't know was there, right? You may have one of those shelves behind you. Apparently Dan Brown has one of those bookshelves in his castle, or the castle now that his wife has in France or whatever. But for me, I felt like I walked into a room that I had never been in, and it startled me. And what was in that room was an idea that every culture kind of looks at the world a certain way. Maybe this is in and of itself not surprising, but that the way we look at the world affects how we look at our life. And that every culture kind of has a paradigmatic life course that we are expected to follow. Okay? So that in the ancient world, when there was no linear time, they thought life followed the seasons. To every season, turn, because that's how they looked at life. And in the Middle Ages, and as you know, in the book, I actually found a whole series of graphic representation of this, which blew my mind. In the middle, the Bible introduces in the West the idea of linear time. And then if you look in the Middle Ages, that is where a whole series of ideas, again, that we just assume have always been there, that life is in stages and that we are actors, right? This is all has to do with the middle class in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Theater became important. Shakespeare's The Stages of Man, all of these things. And they have these graphic representations that life is a staircase up to middle age, at which point we peak and then we decline. Okay? Now that is completely different from how those of us who were raised in the 20th century, we were taught that the middle age was a trough and then it was up. But this is how people looked at it. And so essentially what I sort of stumbled onto was this notion that how we were taught in the 20th century is in fact a historical aberration. Okay, that since the birth of science, and that corresponds to an industrial kind of factory-based way of looking at the world, we were told that life proceeds in a series of linear stages. And if you look all across the history of psychology, in the first 100 years, Piaget, stages that a child goes through. Freud with the psychosexual development. Erikson with the 8 stages of moral development. And Erikson says explicitly and expressly that this was based on the conveyor belt, right? That this was an industrial model. And this all reaches its peak in the 70s with Gail Sheehy, who writes passages which plagiarizes the idea of the midlife crisis from Roger Gould at UCLA and Dan Levinson at Yale.
You don't use that word casually. She was actually sued.
She was actually sued. She put this in New York Magazine. She credits Levinson. She doesn't credit Roger Gould, who sues her and wins. And she's a poor single mom, struggling writer or whatever it was at New York Magazine at the time. So she says, okay, I don't have any money. I'll give you 10% of the royalties of passages.
Which turns out to be $1 jillion. This, for our younger viewers and listeners, this was one of the biggest bestsellers of all time, Passages.
20 million copies. The Library of Congress declared it one of the 20 most influential books of the 20th century. It was enormous. And what it says is we all do the same thing in our 20s, the same thing in our 30s, and that we all have a midlife crisis that must start by 39 and a half and will end by 45. It is so, and the subtitle of Passages, The Predictable Crises of Adult Life. This all turns out to be bunk. And again, I think it was bunk then. In fact, it was quite soon debunked by a series of scholars in the 1980s who studied it, but it's completely irrelevant now because what's happened is, this is what I mean by geeking out on the science for a second. We now understand that the world, through chaos theory, through complexity, through the internet and a kind of webbed way of understanding the world, we now know that there are periods of stability and instability, periods of periodicity and periodicity. And that's how we look at the world, but what we haven't done and what in effect I'm attempting to do in Life is in the Transitions is say it's time to update how we look at the paradigmatic shape of our lives. Okay.
Now, as you said, you do a lot of research. You interviewed over 200 people. You have a standard kind of interview format, which you replicate at the end of the book, and you're encouraging people to kind of submit their own stories. I know, readers. The fascinating stories, I gotta say, in fact, I kind of lowered my self-esteem. I thought, like, my life is really not very interesting. These people have had interesting lives. I mean, I may be the last person leading a linear life, Bruce. I don't know. And even I found your book interesting, even though, I'm the perhaps the least likely given that linearity. But, they are fascinating stories. I mean, now how did you choose the people? I assume they came to your attention in different ways?
So I had this idea. I was going to go off and talk to people. Now, who are the people I'm going to do? So I started with people that I knew. And I'd be shocked. Did I not in the course of this ask you, as I asked everybody I know, who do you know who's had an interesting life story? And I was a few months into, and I have people, I have a 2-time cancer survivor who climbed Mount Everest. I have the former leading neo-Nazi in America who had a conversion and came out. A quarter of my stories involve addiction of some kind. I have Goldman Sachs partners whose children had incredibly rare diseases. I have a guy who was a tenured theoretical physicist who taught at the School of Advanced International Studies not far from where you sit as we speak, who left to devote himself full-time to his YouTube comedy band Ninja Sex Party. The stories were amazing. And a couple of months into this, I say to my wife, I said, I think I can get 25 states. And this will tell you about my marriage. She said, get 50 or shut up, and turned and walked out of the room. So I became over time kind of more systematic to make sure, once I realized I was onto something, to make sure that I had all ages and all walks of life and all demographics and all states. And at the end of every conversation, I said, who do you know who's an interesting story? And it soon kind of metastasized. And as is definitely happening to me since the book is coming out, people are stepping forward and say, you should add my story. But then I had this trough and I didn't know what to do with it. I had 1,000 hours of interviews, had 6,000 pages of transcripts. It came to the shoulders of my adolescent daughters at the time. And I decided to come up with, to sort of devise a methodology modeled on Good to Great, and a process that Dan McAdams at Northwestern, who has sort of pioneered this idea of life story interviews. By the way, we should say the midlife crisis, Dan Levinson at Yale in the 70s, 40 people, all in New Haven, all men. Okay, even the person who came up with the idea of the midlife crisis, Elliot Jacques, said he didn't even talk to anybody. He only read 300 biographies, and they were of men. And he said, I can't talk about women because menopause will throw everything off. Like, that's how restrictive and limited the intellectual foundation for these ideas that are essentially universally accepted have been. And so I end up with all these stories, and then we just started digging through them, trying to find patterns. And I think that now that gets us to kind of, what happened was discovering I didn't go into it interested in change or even interested in transitions, but that's clearly what emerged quite quickly as the sort of defining human event in this life of hastened change.
Okay. And so I guess to talk about your kind of model of change, maybe we should start at kind of what you might call the atomic level with the disruptors, They're like the smaller elements in your model. I mean, we can just say quickly, disruptors make for lifequakes in your model. Lifequakes are bigger than any one disruptor is likely to be. But talk about this business of disruptors. Once you start talking about it, I think we'll all recognize the kind of thing you're talking about.
So the linear life is dead. It's been replaced by the nonlinear life. The atom, yes, the essential ingredient of the nonlinear life is what I call a disruptor. I've specifically chosen the word disruptor because it's value neutral, and because they can be positive or negative. So a disruptor could be an accident. It could be changing religions. It could be getting married. It could be becoming an empty nester. And what I found is that we go through 36 of these in the course of our lives. That's one every 12 to 18 months. It's more often than some people see a dentist. And most of these we get through relatively quickly. We are actually pretty good at change. But then what happens is that 1 in 10 of these, that's 3 to 5 times in our lives, we go through a massive change, which I call a lifequake. Again, they could be positive or negative, and voluntary or involuntary. And a lifequake is sort of higher on the Richter scale of consequences and has aftershocks that last for years. And so to come up with these numbers, I did two things. I went through all of the interviews, and I ended up with this 52 different types of disruptors. I call it the deck of disruptors in my book. And the last list that was very similar was done in the late 60s. And what was it? It was different. I mean, that list only has one about religion, and I had 6 or 7 because people become more religious, less religious, change religions. I mean, as you know, half of Americans change faith in the course of our lives. 4 in 10 of us are in interfaith religion. In an interfaith marriage. Also, none of the kind of contemporary flashpoints, domestic violence, Me Too, none of that. Any of that stuff was on those old lists. Entrepreneurialism. I'm married to a woman who works in entrepreneurship. Starting an enterprise was not on the list. So the list has gotten bigger. There's more of these changes because divorce, of course, has become much more common. Non-traditional marriages, adoption, all these things have become much more common. And so I kind of husband a whole slew of data to show that the pace of these changes is greater, and the spread in our lives where we experience them is also wider.
Okay, and a disruptor can be either something that happens to you or something you choose to make happen, right?
Absolutely. A move is a disruptor. Yeah, I mean, let's talk about lifequakes in particular, because with the lifequakes, I actually dug in and analyzed them. So I did them on a graph. So voluntary or involuntary. So a voluntary lifequake would be leaving a bad marriage, deciding to get sober, changing jobs, moving. An involuntary lifequake would be having your spouse cheat on you, or losing your job, or having an accident and losing your legs, getting a diagnosis. So I did voluntary and involuntary. 47% were voluntary. 53% were involuntary. You mentioned younger viewers. I don't know your demographics, but I was born in 1964. So I'm nominally at the tail end of the baby boom. And I looked, I was like, whoa, 47% of these lifequakes were voluntary? Like, wow, we have impact on our lives. I had all these millennial coders, and they were like, what? Darn, 53% are involuntary. They were still under the delusion that they could control their lives. So I did personal and collective, voluntary and involuntary, and then I did personal and collective. So the largest category was personal and involuntary, an accident, you have a child with special needs, etc. The next was personal and voluntary, changing religions, moving. By the way, 61% of the people moved in my study in the course of their life transition. And I don't know about you, but 61% of the conversations I'm in today, people are talking about moving. but the collective ones were small. And this is kind of, now we get to the present moment that you alluded to earlier.
By collective ones, you mean?
A collective lifequake would be 9/11. It would be a natural disaster.
The things we all share, like a pandemic.
Exactly. Like a
things
recession.
That happen to a bunch of us at the same time.
So there's this line in my book where like, had I done, and there was like only 8% were collective involuntary. And there's a line in my book that was like a throwaway line, which is that, had I done these conversations a century ago when there were 2 world wars and depression, there would have been many more collective involuntary lifequakes. And I've been working on this for 5 years, and lo and behold, the book appears at a moment when the entire planet is going through I would say a collective involuntary lifequake in the pandemic. But on top of that, we've now added a collective voluntary lifequake, which is the protest movement and the kind of reckoning with, centuries of racial injustice. That's a personal voluntary lifequake. And actually, in my own mind, I think that I just written a piece about this in Time Magazine. There's actually a connection, I think, between the two. Between the fact that we were going through one of the things that happened in these conversations that I had not read about in the literature of social change that's out there and life course is that these lifequakes tend to clump together. Mm-hmm. Right? Just when you lose your job, your daughter is found to have a anxiety disorder. Just when you're going to move, you wreck the car and your mother-in-law dies. So there is something about them that clumped. And I ultimately nicknamed this a pileup because it reminded me of the old black and white movies, right? Where the car stops and then boom, 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 boom. Mm-hmm. There's 2 car pileups and 3 car pileups. So what makes a pileup? I mean, some of it's obviously coincidental. It just happens. But I think a greater reason is that it's like our immune system is weakened somehow by a lifequake, so that something that we might normally just get through and wouldn't institute or kind of trigger a big change triggers a big change. And that's what I think has happened in 2020, that we already have the sort of political lifequake that we've all been in of Trump and sort of the instability that exists because of that, right? Witness how Trump led to the Women's March, right? Mm-hmm. And then to Me Too and to a whole series of other changes that may or may not have happened. You then have this pandemic. So already we're kind of like the environment has been seeded for change. And then I think when the murder of George Floyd happens, it more easily spilled over into the large movement because I think we already were in a climate.
Definitely. I think. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, even as we talk, I'm sitting here thinking I've been through more earthquakes than I realized.
Lifequakes, maybe
I mean, lifequakes, yeah.
Yeah, let's ask you. So give me a lifequake in my life. Well, give me a period where you went through a lot of change.
I mean, in general, I have to admit, I feel kind of short on lifequakes. That's what I meant when I said maybe my life's been more linear than many. I feel like I'd like to have one now. I feel like I need one now.
Yes, right.
Which is a different matter. And maybe to extend the metaphor, it's like tectonic plates have been moving or something, and you feel you need one, but that's a different thing. What I was just alluding to is that, now that you mention it, Trump was a lifequake for me and was. I mean, because like three of my 4 siblings voted for Trump. It changed our family relations. It meant we can't talk politics at family reunions. And that's just like 1/15 of the significance to me of Trump having been elected. I mean, he was I'm just thinking this now, but he represents defiance of a whole worldview I outlined in a whole book I wrote, and I mean, so I even after reading your book, I hadn't thought, well, Trump was a lifequake for me, but it kind of was. The pandemic was in a different way, and there it's just interacted with my situation, where I am, where I live, yes. how I feel about risk compared to other members of my family. It gets, I don't know if you've had this whole issue, but it can get complicated.
We're trying to have our annual kind of family get together, and we spent weeks. And I was like, finally, like, everyone's going to have to push their rules to the center of the table, and we're going to have to horse trade to see if we can do this. But you've also, in your life, what I found is that nonlinearity does not mean constant nonlinearity, right? It means periods of stability and stuff. And even people who have had, like, let's say in your case, a long, stable relationship, right? And a continual connection with your children have had disruption or lifequakes in other areas. You've had, in the the five kind of big storylines I talk about in my book are love, work, body, identity, and beliefs. Okay, so you've certainly had work life quakes. Okay, let's just say you've not had love quakes and you've not had a physical disruption like cancer or loss of limbs that I'm aware. But you've had beliefs. You've had a number of massive changes in beliefs in the course of your life.
In the course of my life, yeah, that's true. I think partly it has to do, I guess, with whether you're inclined to frame these things as changes. We're going to get to the question of story. What is the story you tell about yourself? And maybe part of what we're saying is, I tell the story about myself that I'm just the kind of person who deals with change. I don't make a big deal of it. It's like my father was just this kind of pretty stoic person, and I think I kind of admired that. And he just dealt with whatever came, and he didn't complain a lot. And so come to think of it, maybe part of my story is that I'm not the kind of person to call a lifequake a lifequake,
Well, I think that now we get to something interesting, okay? Which is, so let's just pause a little bit on, so two things let's put on the table here. One, I want to pause a little bit and talk a little bit about the story that you tell yourself, because that is a big underpinning of what I'm talking about here. But I want to put a flag in, and I want to come back in a second to something also that I think that you would be interested on, which is this idea that there is a generational change in our understanding and acceptance of nonlinearity. So that there's a difference between people of your generation and your children's generation. Okay. And I want to hear you on this topic because
there definitely is. Yes.
Because I have had conversations with you about your children, and I understand that you look at them trying to understand why it is that your linear construct for storytelling is not the way that they appear to be telling their story. So let's come back to that and let's talk a little bit about storytelling. So there has been, and we'll geek out on it first. Well, before we geek out on it, let me pop out on it a second. So let me just say, stop for a second, anybody listening or watching, and listen to that story that's going on in your head. It's the story of where you came from and what's important to you. It's a story of where you're going. Like, if you got a call right now that you had to rush to the hospital because a loved one was there, like, what is the story that would be going on in your head? How are you adjusting that story right now as we go through this pandemic? That story is the story of your life. And one thing we've learned in psychology, it was a radical idea in the early 1980s when Jerome Bruner and Dan McAdams and a series of academics in different disciplines started saying that story is central to who we are. Oliver Sacks later kind of helped popularize this. Now we know, because of neuroscience, it's not just part of who we are, it is who we are in a fundamental way. Like, life is the story that you tell yourself. We know that our brains are wired to process in story. We think in story. Other people think of us in story, the interaction in the story. So that story, life is a narrative. Life is a narrative opportunity and a narrative experience in a fundamental way. Now, the problem that we have, I mentioned narrative adolescence earlier. That's when we begin to think of our lives as a story. But what happens is, because, almost like the children do this first, we think of our lives as superheroes think of their lives, right? Or as fairy tales in some way. There's a hero and there's a happy ending. And what we forget is that it's the wolf that makes the story. And that our lives are going to be interrupted by a wolf, a dragon, an ogre, a downsizing or tornado, a death, a pandemic. And that there is no story without conflict, because there's nothing to tell. And the story is fundamentally about how we get through the conflict and resolve the conflict in some way. And so one way of thinking of these lifequakes is as conflicts in our lives. They are essentially giant wolves that we run into in the forest. This is not how we talk about our lives, but this is fundamentally what's going on in our lives. And I think that therefore I like this phrase that a sociologist invented in the 80s named Robert Zimmerman I'm trying to kind of revive, which is that a lifequake is an autobiographical occasion, right? So an autobiographical occasion, and the original definition of it was when you go to the doctor and you give your medical history, right? Or you go on a first date, or a job interview is an autobiographical occasion. I think this can be broadened. This phrase should be repopularized, and this is an autobiographical occasion. We're going through a pandemic. How is each of us going to respond? How is our life going to change? Because it's going to affect our relationships, our spirituality, our beliefs, where we live, what we do, how we care for our children, our parents. Everybody's going to be affected by one of those, and most of us are going to be affected by more than one. And therefore, this is an autobiographical occasion when we all are rethinking about our life story right now. So that's the narrative part. And I guess I should let you respond before I then get to the generational gap issue.
Well, you mean respond in the sense of, we should say that your model is basically about kind of reconstructing a story, right, in response to a lifequake, right? Reauthoring your story in a way that makes sense. I was thinking, just as an aside, in thinking about how I respond to the pandemic, I guess I take pride in kind of my rationality. I'm trying to not overreact and just assess the risk rationally, which I won't get further into my domestic situation here, but my approach is not universally shared. No, I don't mean to call anyone in my household irrational. I totally don't. I mean that. And I will leave it there. But maybe that's
why you've had a long marriage, because
I always leave it there.
You've had a long linear relationship because you have different approaches.
Certainly there's complementarity is bliss. Yes. It's a
nice Catholic term.
But take this wherever you want. This is your model is, yes. So that's just an aside. That's what that triggered when you started talking about how a pandemic is an opportunity to tell ourselves, a story. You could choose it as a time to reauthor your story and say, I've always been kind of risk averse. I'm going to go crazy, which actually might be crazy in this case, but a lifequake is an opportunity to tell a new story. Now the kinds of lifequakes you deal with in the book are times when it's deeply in your interest to come up with a story because they are lifequakes that are causing very serious trouble.
So you've alluded to this model thing a couple times. So let me just sort of try to explain that to people who are, coming into this conversation. So, one interesting, back to kind of things that I learned that surprised me, which is that transitions were something that were in favor in the 20th century, and that language has gone out of favor. And so I'm trying to return to this. The idea of a life transition was actually invented, as you know, from Life is in a Transitions, by the way, in and of itself, a William James expression from a century ago. So the idea that life has these regular transitions was invented by a German anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep in the first decade of the 20th century. He invented the phrase rites of passage, which his translator now says should be rites of transition. And he talked about these liminal moments in our lives. And the way he talked about it is that a life transition involves kind of three activities, leaving one room, he said, walking down a hallway and entering into another room. And that model, insofar as people wrote about this in the 20th century, was revived by a guy named Victor Turner in the 60s, and then in the 1970s by an English professor named William Bridges, who wrote what is essentially the last big book on life transitions in 1979. And they all said that there were these three phases, and that, more important, because this is the linear age at that time, you must do them in order. First, you must say goodbye to the old room, the old you, then you go through this betwixt and between, and then you must enter the new room. Like, by the way, the 5 stages of grief, like another linear construct, that you have to do them in order. So I asked everybody kind of micro steps, like the biggest emotion they struggled with, what advice from friends was most valuable, and, what kind of stages they went through and in what order. And kind of a signature finding of this is that this linear model of life transitions is just wrong. There are 3 phases, which I call the long goodbye, where you say goodbye to the old you. The messy middle, where you shed certain habits and create new habits, and the new beginning, where you unveil your new self and finally, as you said, update your life story. But we do not do them in order. In fact, everybody is good at one of the phases. I call it your transition superpower, and bad at one of them. And we tend to gravitate to the phase we're good at. So some people are really bad at saying goodbye because they're people pleasers. They don't want to, induce conflict, and they're just comfortable, and they stay in a bad marriage too long, or drinking too long, or in a job they should leave. But I talked to a woman, Nina Collins, who lost her mother when she was 19, and she's since had 3 marriages and twice as many jobs. And she said, I'm good at goodbye. I under-attach to things. And so I get stuck in the middle. Other people don't get stuck in the middle. I talked to a guy named Rob Adams, a management consultant from the Midwest who was hired to run the Simon Pierce Glass Company in Vermont, a family-run company. He goes up there. He starts a month after the Great Recession. Sales dropped by 1/3 in the first quarter. He should have gone, but it took him a year before the family asked him to leave. And he's like, I like being a mentor. I was bad at saying goodbye, but once I got to the middle, I'm a consultant. I made lists. I'm very rational. And he came up with a plan and moved the family to Africa to run a nonprofit. Even some people are bad at the new beginning, which you would think we would all enjoy. I talked to this woman. I love this story, Lisa Ludovici. She was born in Pittsburgh, broken family. Her mother was not particularly interested in being her mom. She went to college at Penn State. Her mother didn't even come to her graduation. She lived in her car for a while. She was homeless. She went to work, speaking of Washington, she went to work at the new startup America Online, became over 20 reorgs, became a massive internet ad executive, but she had 3 migraines a week since she was 3. And one day she logs onto a conference call. People don't know she's there. They're talking about how sour she is. She goes home, combs through her Amex bills, walks in the next day, quits on the spot. Doesn't go out to eat, stops shopping, cuts her cable. She's watching local access TV, sees somebody who tries to help people and says, I'm going to become a life coach. Goes to life coach school in Santa Fe, has her head on the table on day 1. The teacher says, what's wrong? She says, I'm having a migraine. Don't worry. I have 3 a week. It's not a big deal. Teacher says, come with me, puts her in a chair in her office, hypnotizes her. She's never had another migraine. She's now America's leading medical hypnotist, works with VA veterans. And she said, even with all the success, she was too scared to update her LinkedIn profile because her friends would think it was weird. So she was bad at leaving, but she was even worse at the new beginning because she was too embarrassed by this change that she went through. So everybody's good at it. One thing I try to do in the book is walk people through identifying which one you're good at and bad at, so you can start with one that you're good at and build from there.
Okay. So,
and this is, I'm sorry, just to button this up, this idea of this structure and the various tools that I articulate that people use is the first new model for life transitions in 40 years. So that was an interesting thing that people haven't been talking about, which I've been believing for years we should revive, and now obviously it's coming at this moment when we all need it. But just to the last point I'll make is that the lifequake that you go through, back to your pandemic analogy, and maybe even your personal situation, which you wanted to talk about, is the lifequake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition that comes out of it must be voluntary. You have to lean in and choose to go through the steps and utilize the tools in order to get through it and turn it into the renewal and period of growth that it has the potential to be.
Okay. Talk just a little about your little ABC mnemonic device and how those three things, the A, the B, and the C, relate to all of this.
So if you go back a century ago, most of our meaning, most of what gave us identity and meaning were given to us. Most people had to live where their parents wanted them to live, do what their parents wanted them to do, marry who their parents wanted them to marry, believe what their parents wanted them to believe. One of the massive, epical, we still don't talk about it enough, consequences of the 20th century is that most of that has been overthrown. You can live where you want to live and believe what you want to believe and do what you want to do. Obviously, women have, market more freedom than they had in the past. You can now, even in the last few years, we've learned you can change your body and your sexuality in ways that we didn't even think was possible. Marry who you want to marry. I mean, the pace of this change is remarkable. The upside is you get to write your own story, right? You can live the life you want to live. The downside is it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
For a lot, if not most people. Like we get writer's block.
And I think millennials are really confronting, I think a lot of millennials are really grappling with the relative lack of structure that life has. That's partly a result of the economy they find themselves in, the technological world they find themselves in. I think it's also a product of the way we raise them. I mean, as in effect, you've just said. What's that?
I mean, you can be whatever you want to be, and that's just too many choices.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was almost part of our child rearing religion that, I mean, different parents are different. And I think in my case, I had the odd pair of parents who in a certain sense weren't all that hands-on or directive, and maybe to some extent I'm following in their footsteps. And I say odd for that generation.
Your parents were not hands-on, or you and your wife?
They weren't. I just don't recall a lot of explicit guidance. I mean, I think they were both really good role models, and they kind of left it at that. I don't, and they don't. Now, my father would have liked me to apply to West Point. Wow.
There you go.
Talking right, exactly. You know me well enough to know what a disaster that would have been.
He did know that required taking orders?
Well, you've listed one of about 37 problems with that scenario, yes. But anyway, they never told me to do my homework. They never, I just don't remember a lot of that stuff or steering me toward great achievement. I mean, they weren't even that achievement oriented. I mean, like they were like disappointed that I was going to go to Princeton because it wasn't in Texas.
Okay. So now we're getting to this thing that I want to hear you on this topic. Okay. Because an undeniable reality of sitting, when I first started this project, I thought, I should talk to people 40 plus because they've been beaten around by life a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. And my wife, Linda, who I've alluded to her a few times, Linda Rotenberg, who started and runs an organization called Endeavor that supports entrepreneurs in 40 countries. And she's got more or less 500 millennials working for her around the world. She's like, you're wrong. Like millennials also have a life story. And so you should talk to them. And she was right. And I was wrong. And good thing she didn't walk in when I said that because she would remind me of it all the time. But one of the clear things was that, so let's just say that you're a boomer, and let's assume that therefore your parents were either greatest or silent generation or whatever. What? Greatest?
Yeah, right. My father was in World War II. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So what we're talking about is that boomers, even though we're still haunted by the ghost of linearity, okay, that we got more of this change than our parents did, for sure. Xers more than boomers understand it, and millennials more than Xers. Mm-hmm. So that leads to this kind of transition gap that a lot of parents that I talk to in their 60s are looking at their children in their 20s and early 30s and saying, wait a minute, you are having a child before you get married, right? Or you're leaving one job without having the next job, or you're moving to a city, like they are looking at their parents, their children, and they're saying, wait a minute, you're doing all of this zigzagging, and it seems nonlinear, changing careers in the middle in the way that we never would have at 28 or 32, or would have seemed much more wrenching to us and to our parents. That is the norm. Okay. So this now allows me to say that so I want to then go back to the ABCs of meaning, but is that what you're experiencing with your children? Like they're just doing these things and they're zigging and zagging at a much quicker pace than you would have?
There's some of that. And I've also heard it from other millennials, like when I was teaching briefly at Union Theological Seminary. Well, one of the things was just like, and this is something I think you and I probably feel too, is like, you're never done. It's like, there's always something more you could be doing at any time of day in furtherance of your work or your career. My father, there are probably some people so young, they don't know where the term inbox comes from. Okay. So my father on his desk, he was an Army officer. He had a stack of 2 boxes big enough to hold documents. There was an inbox and an outbox. And he would, like something like what you can see on your desk. And they were labeled inbox in and out. And every morning he'd come in and his secretary would have put a bunch of stuff in the inbox. And he said he would not go home until he had taken every document in the inbox and put it in the outbox. And then he was done. And he would come home and have a scotch and watch Walter Cronkite.
Well, my parents, I grew up with cocktail hour, 5 o'clock in Savannah, Georgia. Same thing. My dad, well, it's not just that he wouldn't go home until it was empty. It's that he would go home when it was empty. So
that's even better.
That's even a harder trick for us to do today because it's never empty.
Right.
Because it's going to fill up later. Yeah. My dad would come home and have a drink, and it was like, cocktail hour for my dad and my mom, so that we could have family dinner at 6 o'clock, because that was the time devoted to the children. Mm-hmm. Okay, so back to my answer to your question. So the pace of change, okay, the linear life is dead. It's been replaced by the nonlinear life. There are a host of advantages that we never want to go back. We certainly don't. You should be able, like if you had stayed in the Ozarks or Texas or South Georgia or wherever, you or I were growing up, or anybody else listening to us, and you had non-traditional sexuality, that would have been hard, or you wanted a non-traditional career choice, that would have been much hard. You would have been much more trapped in your family lineage and in the expectations of you. So there are so many advantages, but there also are downsides, which is the psychic burden of having to tell your own story and to build your own identity. So I tried to figure out what is it that what are the gears that people use? And so what I identified in this whole coding is what I have come to call the ABCs of meaning. Okay. So the A is agency. That's what you do, what you make, what you create, your work life, your self life. Okay. That's your A. The B is belonging. That's your relationships, your community, your loved ones, your family, your friends, your religious community, your colleagues, whatever it might be. And the C is your cause. You're calling something higher than yourself. Okay. And the narrative, in the narrative kind of framework of this book, I call this your me story, your we story, and your the story. Okay. And so we have these, and it turns out people, when you ask them, as I did, the shape of, tell me the shape of your life, like how you think of your life, agency first people tend to come up with a line. That's something that's up or down, a winding river, a road, a mountain, a stock market. They tend to come up with a line. That's what I would have done. If I asked you, my guess is almost assuredly, what shape is your life, Bob? You would have given me a line. I'm almost
it would be a line.
Guarantee it. But everybody doesn't do it. In fact, I learned this. I have this guy, Michelangelo, I talk about in my book, who actually cuts my hair. And I was sitting there one day and I was like, so Michael, what's the shape of your life? And he said, a heart. I was like, no, you don't understand. I'm asking you like the trajectory of a life. It's a heart. I'm like, no, you're not hearing me. Let me communicate. I want to know like how your life has moved through time. And he said, no, you're not hearing me, hotshot. Like I'm telling you that the ups and downs of my professional life is not the dominant shape of my life. It's a heart. The relationships are more important than my own success. And that was when I realized, whoa, I'm like really misunderstanding this. Like I talked to this woman, Michelle Swaim, who also grew up in a broken family, married her high school sweetheart, who was a preacher. He was the dominant. She was sort of a broken person. She became anorexic in her 20s. She was down to eating half an apple a day, and she would run like, miles, 10, 15 miles a day. And they were unable to get pregnant, as happens to some anorexic people. And one day she slips on the ice, has an accident, ends up in the hospital. She has a vision from God who comes to her and says, I did this to you on purpose. Her husband walks in the next day. I was visited by God. He said he did this to you on purpose. She changed her life, and they adopted 11 children from 8 refugee countries around the world. And she says to me that the shape of her life is a dented minivan. So the people who tend to be relationship oriented come up with a shape that contains people, a house, a heart, a dented minivan. And the cause people tend to have an object. My wife, who works with entrepreneurs, she's like, the shape of her life is a light bulb. She helps other people make their ideas come true, right? Boxing gloves, an infinity symbol, lettuce for plant-based medicine, or whatever it might be. And people, so I'm an ABC. So I'm agency first, belonging second, and then cause. My wife is a CAB. She's cause first, agency, belonging. So what's your order?
I gotta say, I think in my case, C rivals A. You had me pegged for A, but as you know,
yes,
I am plagued with this kind of sense of mission that apparently grows out of my Southern Baptist outbringing, or something that it's too late for me to change. But certainly belonging would be, I'm third. Yeah, I'm not nearly as, I don't think I'm as proactively social as you are by a long shot, or as communal or anything else. I would think for you, belonging rivals A. I would think for you, but maybe I'm wrong.
In fact, you can hear the relationships outside my door here.
Wait, did you say you're ABC or ACB?
I'm ABC.
Right. Okay.
I'm agency first. I'm very family and friend, and then I'm a cause is a third for me. But my guess is, I don't know your wife well, but my guess is she's going to be belonging first.
Yes, by a long shot.
Yeah. So here we go, this interesting sort of compatibility. But here's now the point that we're getting to all this. Everybody has an order, but what happens in a lifequake is that we shapeshift, is that we reimagine and recalibrate and rebalance the ABC. So I think of the ABCs of meaning as like kind of Lady Liberty with 3 scales instead of two, and that we re-weight them in these moments. And that's where we are right now. Like everybody listening to us either lay awake last night or, got up this morning with a cup of coffee and is wondering, like, do I have a job? If I have a job, is it the right job? Do I need to leave my job to take care of my children or aging parents? Do I have a medical problem? Do I want to move? Do I want to, as I said, get sober? Do I want to make a change in my life? Am I the person that I want to be? And that is what happens in times like this. We kind of rebalance. Maybe we've been working too hard and we want to spend more time with our loved ones. Maybe we've been a parent, a primary parent, and we're an empty nester now and we want to give back. Maybe we've been giving back and we burn out and we want to do something for ourselves. So one of the things that's going on right now in the world is that we all are kind of revisiting the balance of power in the ABCs of meaning.
Okay. So, I want to go back to something we just touched on and use it to talk more about stories. I said that, millennials have told me they have this feeling that there's always something more they could be doing. There's the workday is never over. That may not sound so centrally related to what we're talking about, but it is related to that is the amount of opportunity they have. Yes. I mean, in other words, they could go online and be doing any number of things at any point. They could be making a contact that will allow them to move into a different kind of work. They could be, learning stuff that will be valuable. They could be on Tinder meeting somebody that will lead to their leaving their current mate. They could be doing all kinds of things. And one of the things that they're spending a lot of time doing, whether they think about it or not, is advertising their story, constructing their story. And at the end of the book, you emphasize that that's not the same as the kind of storytelling you think we need to do more of, right?
So let me just unpack that for a second. So yes, I think that the abundance of choice now, again, I want to kind of use the frame I used earlier to say that there are many, many, many more advantages to this than there are disadvantages to this. I mean, in family, I've written a lot about family in my book, Secrets of Happy Families. I wrote a column in the New York Times for a decade about contemporary families. And one just wonderful thing about contemporary families is that that there has been a change. You have now women outside the home, 3/4 of women working outside the home, and which is we talk about a lot, but there's this other change, which is that men are much more involved in the parenting space than they've ever been before. And that and a consequence of that is that the membrane that divided work from family is much more porous than it's ever been. And those holes have been blown open by the pandemic, which is also going to be great because kind of work-life balance issues, which were previously kind of largely gendered in the sense that mostly women worried about them. Now men are going to worry about them, which is going to hasten the change that we all need. And the reason that's relevant to what you just said is that in this world where what was formerly the workday and formerly the family day that we overly romanticized that when we grew up, an advantage of that is that a dad can go coach Little League, a mom can check in with her kids in the middle of the day, then they can go home and be involved in the sort of, what I call the twin nuclear winters of family life, which is the hour after everybody wakes up in the morning and the hour before everyone goes to bed. And then they can go and log on and do work at 9:00 that they might have previously been only able to do at 4:00. So again, that is an advantage of this nonlinearity, that the rigidity of the workday and the rigidity of the family time has been blown open so that we can time shift. And so that's an advantage, by the way, that millennials are soon going to experience. Remember now, the tip of the millennials is hitting 40 and 90+% of the children in the world are now born to a millennial mom. So actually that breakup, one thing about millennials is they don't even like the term mom and dad anymore. It's like co-parent because they're ungendering a lot of this, and that's really great. The problem is that you need some boundaries and that you need some structure. And that relates to then this point you just made, which is the storytelling point, right? Which is you would think storytelling is everywhere because when you and I grew up, we grew up in places and we grew up in a country where a small number of people had a microphone and the rest of us had to listen.
Mm-hmm.
You and I left those places and managed to find our way through luck and good fortune and friendship and a whole source of other things that happened to us in our lives. We went out and we grabbed the microphone. And you and I have both been privileged to have, a microphone for a long period of time. We now live in a multi-microphone world. Everybody's got a microphone.
Right. I mean, in a way, yeah. I mean, one of my lifequakes was actually having the microphone not quite taken away, right. But I mean, when I came up, it was work to get to a point.
Yes.
Where you were like having, writing cover stories for Time and The Atlantic and being well paid, and there weren't many people, and it was kind of like a club. And you felt you had worked to get there, and of course you had privilege of many kinds, there's no doubt about that. But anyway, you were there, and it wasn't that like young rivals had to work really hard to unseat you, right? Yes, right. And so then just as I, at least, you're younger than I am, get to an age where you might start feeling a little vulnerable anyway, kind of middle-aged, late middle-age, even if the world had stayed the same. Suddenly, yes. It's a lot easier for people to grab microphones. The internet is here. And I realized while reading your book, that has been, lifequake doesn't come to mind because it happened so gradually. It was more like a shifting of the tectonic plates that does, in fact, add up to a lifequake. But anyway, that was enough about me. Go ahead and take the conversation.
This happened to me too. The way I talk about it is, my metaphor for this is I scraped and clawed and got myself to the top of the mountain only to have the mountain melt underneath me.
Right.
Is that if you went back 10 years in your professional life and my professional life, we both had what you might call tenure at that time. Like we had gotten there and we were not going to, when we were going to have the opportunity. That is not true anymore. And that is what I'm saying, that we live in a multi-microphone world where everybody can tell their story, which again is awesome and has many more benefits than downsides, but it has downsides, not least of which we have to decide at all times what story we want to tell. You talk to young parents, you talk to millennial parents. I did a piece about this in the New York Times, so I spent a long time digging into this. I coined this group of people perennials, right? Because they're this portmanteau between parents and millennials, and they have to make a decision. Do they want to tell a story about their children that the children are like, say, Beyonce's children in beautiful suits, surrounded by flowers and, tap dancing on the table, well lit with, ring lighting and their hair and makeup done? Or do they want to say to their kids pooping in the bath? And that actually is something of a burden on a young parent that we never had, which is what sort of story? So we think that we're telling stories all the time, and to a certain extent we are. But yes, to your point at the end, there is a story that we're not telling, which is the story of our lives. And this much larger scope. I'm just struck in this conversation. I'm really struck, and I want to try to think about it. I'm struck in this conversation that you've said 4 or 5 times, I did not realize until I read your book that was a lifequake, or that was a meaningful transition in my life. Because what I'm hearing when you say that, what I'm feeling, besides gratitude that you actually read my book, but what I'm feeling when I'm hearing is, this is what initially, when I pulled that book off my shelf and there was the library opened up and I was in a different room, was like, we don't talk about this. We don't talk about the course of our lives, and we do not talk about our lives as a story. And we certainly don't talk about our lives as something that we're going to have 3 to 5 lifequakes in it, that the average length of time, as I found, is 5 years. 3 to 5, they take 4, 5, 6 years. That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives that we are in transition, and we've lost this language. And maybe you're good at navigating it, but most of us aren't. And therefore, we need to refocus attention on this thing that we haven't focused on in 50 years, which is understanding that our lives have a kind of shape and that we are actors in creating that shape and tellers in telling our own life story.
Yeah. So what would you recommend? And I think you would say that, look, even if you don't think of yourself, I mean, as we've said, you say that if you're going, through a lifequake and to appreciate the diversity of available lifequakes, people just need to read the book. There's a lot of different people going through a lot of different kinds of change. But even assuming that upon reflection, you still don't think you qualify as going through a lifequake, I think you would say it's still a healthy thing to think about your story, to tell your story, talk about your story. So what would you recommend that people kind of concretely do? Should they grab somebody off the street and say, listen to my story? Should they, you're suggesting that, Twitter isn't enough. Facebook isn't enough. And of course, just to drill down on that a little, and the plight of millennials and the plight of the rest of us in a way is the weird thing about that is you realize you're telling your story. You realize you're constructing a story. You're getting feedback from all these people who really don't know you. They are responding to just one little thing reflecting on who you are. And the feedback may be suddenly massive. So that's a really unnatural environment in which to tell a story. But anyway, with that as preamble, what would you say what would you advise?
Say a couple things. I want to pick up on something you said, Singer, which even if you don't think you're in a lifequake. So now we are in a situation where this book has been published. Here it is. Life is in the transitions. In the middle of a lifequake. And so now I'm getting feedback, right? This book just was in the top 20 of Amazon. It's had the biggest first week I've had in 30 years of writing books. There was an interesting wrinkle here, right? Which is that a lot of people buying it are in a lifequake, as I said. But it turns out maybe even a bigger market for this book is someone who has a loved one who's going through a lifequake and they feel, frozen or inept or unclear what to do. And they're co-piloting somebody through it. And then they're looking for something to say. So, you've asked two questions. So I want to answer, first of all, what to do if you're in a lifequake and you're not sure what to do, and then how to narrativize that experience. And so the first thing I want to say, like you sent me an email when we were setting this up. I hope I'm not violating privacy, but I know your life is public to your fan base out there, Bob.
More than they would like, assuming that there even is a fan base.
You're like, help me, I want to know what I'm supposed to do in my life, my own life transition right now in my career. And I want to echo what I said earlier. When you go into a lifequake, you feel one of two things. You either feel chaotic and out of control, like you want to do 17 things at once because you're Mr. Fix-It or Mr. or Mrs. Efficiency, and you're the COO of your own life and you're going to get through it. Or you feel inert, kind of like you're in the fetal position on your bed and there's nothing you can do and no one's ever been through this. Look at enough of them, as I have done, and certain patterns begin to appear. And I want to reiterate that the lifequake might be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition needs to be voluntary. You have to say, okay, now that I've absorbed it, I've absorbed the shock, I want to do something about it, and now I'm going to focus on X or Y or Z. That alone is a huge initial step. And then, certainly in this book, I have plenty of concrete tips of identify your feelings and use rituals and shed certain habits and turn to creativity and, unveil your new self and all of these different things, which I didn't make up. I just listened to people and I tabulated them, and then I'm giving them to you, because don't listen to me, just listen to them. You're going to find some of these are not going to be relevant. You may not be an army veteran who had his face shut off in the Taliban, or a woman who was in an arranged marriage at 14 in an Orthodox Jewish community whose husband beat her every night for 20 years. But you're going to find in their examples things that are relevant to you. But to the larger question of the story of your life, there are big things you can do. You go to brucefeiler.com. I have this way you can do a storytelling project with an aging parent, like I did with my dad. I've picked the top 52 questions and I'll email them to you every week. I do have in the back of the book the template that I use, tell me the story of your life, high points, low points, and all the various questions. But I think that the answer to this question, Bob, is something that you learned from writing the many books that you've written, and I've learned from writing the many books I've written, which is that we're not writing books. I say to first-time writers, it's like I think of writing as being like you're in the woods, and you come upon a wolf, ironically enough, and all you have is a bow and an arrow and a quiver. And you're halfway through a paragraph and you're stuck. Like you don't know how to get out of this paragraph. Every arrow in your quiver is a tool to write yourself out of that paragraph. And that your job as a writer is to put as many arrows in your quiver as you can. So that when you're halfway through a paragraph and you're stuck, you've got as many weapons as possible to get yourself out of. And that's by way of making a larger point, which is a book. When you write a book, you're not writing a book. You're writing a series of chapters. A series of chapters are a series of sections. A series of sections are a series of paragraphs. And a series of paragraphs are a series of tools. And so the way to rewrite your story is to think about a wolf, a lifequake, a life transition is you're essentially adding a new chapter to the story of your life. And there are specific things you can do. As you know, in my book, I talk about, go from present tense to past tense, because if you're in present tense, you're still stuck. And with past tense, you've got some distance. Make pigs fly. If you start telling yourself that you're doing things, you actually will do it. But the most important is something that the psychologist Dan McAdams, who kind of invented narrative identity, talks a lot about, which is make sure that your story that chapter has a happy ending. Mm-hmm. So even if it's a negative, even if it's a positive event, like, boy, we just had the biggest quarter in our company's history, but we did it together and we stuck together and we worked hard and we adjusted and that's how we did it. Or dad died after a long illness and he suffered a lot at the end, but at least we came together as a family, and it brought us all closer. And now we're going to have a reunion every year. Fun fact, most family reunions grow out of funerals because people are reminded that they like to be together. So whether it's a positive or negative event, you want to make sure that that chapter, that story has an upbeat ending. And by the way, you can make it up. You get no points for accuracy. You get points for it being effective and allowing you to move on in your life.
So we're all, I mean, I guess you can look at that two ways. I mean, one way is your story about yourself. I mean, maybe this is the more cynical. Your story, everyone has a story about themselves, and they are all bullshit, right? And you might as well be constructive bullshit. That's one way of putting it. Maybe that's not the way you would put it. I mean, it must be somehow constrained by reality, right? I mean, and also there's the practical limit on the kind of person you can become. Like you can say, now I'm becoming the person who's not afraid of X. But of course, to really be the person who's not afraid of X, it takes work. I mean, and you may not be able to do it. It's hard. So what about how constrained should we by the grim reality of ourselves?
I don't feel we need to be that. I don't feel like we need to be that restrained. I mean, I understand why you would say it, because because you're acting in this model of like this. You're suggesting that the story is bullshit, and the reality is the truth. And that's not entirely clear. That the reality also has some constructive identity, has some constructive elements of it. You know, one of the things they tell you to do is compare down, right? Sheryl Sandberg tells this story in option B, right? Her husband, as we all know, childhood friend of my wife's, has an accident when they're on vacation in Mexico, falls on the treadmill and dies. She tells the story that Adam Grant says to her, how could it have been worse? And she's like, what do you mean, how could it have been worse? And she says, he could have had that medical event when he was in a car with your children and they could have died. Like, the reality is grim, but there's always a reality that is worse. Mm-hmm. That is a coping mechanism. You could argue that it's making yourself feel better out of the situation, but that's called being alive. You know, I mean, I talked to a guy named Chris Waddell. He was a mediocre college skier. This is the story I want to tell right now. Chris Waddell was a mediocre college skier at Middlebury, who before his sophomore year has an accident on the slopes and loses the use of his legs. He goes through difficult rehabilitation. Obviously, he's been wheelchair bound ever since. He returns to school and he becomes the country's top disabled skier on a monoski, which looks like a motorcycle with a ski. He then goes on to become a summer Paralympian in long distance racing on a hand cranked wheelchair. Okay. He's the most decorated Paralympian in American history. And he tells me that retiring from being a professional athlete at 35 is more difficult in his life than losing his legs to begin with. And so he struggles to find another thing to do. I say in my book, I call this like he's in between dreams. And he decides he's going to climb Kilimanjaro and become the first person to summit Kilimanjaro in a wheelchair. So he gets this ultimate people. He trains. He goes up. They make a documentary about him. CBS News is broadcasting live from the top of Kilimanjaro. He goes all the way up. People lay these planks out, and he goes all the way up. He's 100 feet from the top, and the boulders are too big, and he can't make it. And they have to pick him up and carry him. So the guides are dancing in Swahili, like they have the climax to their movie. He feels hollow and bankrupt inside, and he tells me it's not till he gets back and they're editing the movie that he realized that he missed the point all along. That he didn't want to be a part of telling the story of the heroic disabled person who overcame challenges to be a hero. He's, I don't want that narrative. In fact, this was a community event, and I needed them to get as far as I got, and then I needed them to get all the way, and I was telling the wrong story. So you tell me there. I told you at the beginning we were going to have this problem that I was your friend and I was going to ruin your reputation of looking only for, to puncture sentimentality. You tell me there what's bullshit and what's the grim reality. Because they're both present in both elements. There's grim reality to his accident. Okay. There's also narrative that allows him to reconstruct it. There's grim reality in that he failed. And then there's also a narrative that he got there with everybody else. Like, you can't separate. The life is about the relationship between reality and the story, and affixing grimness and hope in whatever measure you choose.
That's certainly not a case where I can argue. I mean, that's totally a case where there's a sequence of events that happened. And there's lots of ways of describing, of casting the sequence that are consistent with the facts. And within those limits, you have complete freedom.
That's exactly the point, Bob. We don't know that. I mean, after all these years of narrative theory, we don't really know. If I asked you, what is a story? What would you say? Like, we don't know what a story is. Mm-hmm. Like, the only thing people can agree on is there's two events connected over time. Mm-hmm. As I say in my book, a snowball is not a story. A bloody nose is not a story. The relationship between the snowball and the story, the relationship between the snowball and the nose, that's a story. Okay? But one thing that everybody knows is that stories don't have inherent meaning. We have to give them inherent meaning. And that's the truth about our lives. I mean, do you agree with this? Do you agree that our lives don't have meaning, that we have to give them meaning? You've thought about this.
Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. I mean, I think life inherently has a kind of meaning. Sentient life inherently has a kind of meaning, but the kind of meaning you're talking about, I agree, is essentially assigned.
Not life. You said life has meaning. I'm talking about human life.
Yeah.
There's a human life outside of its participation in an larger ecosystem of life, which can have meaning. Do you believe that each individual human life has meaning, or does that meaning have to be assigned?
Well, I think each individual life has meaning in the sense of just having moral value and being sacred, and you don't walk up and end the life without having done something morally consequential. But you're using meaning differently. And no, I agree that that is a construct. That is an assignment.
Okay. This is a relatively recent construct in at least psychology, right? Is that that the way we assign that construct is through narrative, because fundamentally in the past, we all existed in ecosystems where we inherited the meaning.
Yeah.
That's the big change that allows us to understand that it is our job to make meaning. Now, that is a burden that most people may not want. But ironically, what going through a lifequake does is put it to the top of the agenda. And that, I think, is fundamentally where we are now and why this book is resonating at this moment, because everybody is in a moment where we realize, because of the series of collective lifequakes that we are in, the politics, as we talked about earlier, the pandemic, as we talked about earlier, even the protest movement and our various places in the ecosystem of privilege, opportunity, discrimination, historical legacies of our past, etc. We are in this moment, I think, where narrative identity and the challenge before us to make meaning is at its highest point, arguably since 9/11, but that was pretty ephemeral and not that many of us experienced it. Going back, maybe the 60s in Vietnam with the women's rights and civil rights, but I would argue that it's really for the first time in a century that we are all going through this experience together. And I think that that's going to be fascinating, because while we're going through it together, we've been talking about this from the very beginning, where we're having this collective involuntary lifequake. The way each of us is going to respond is going to be voluntary and different. So your life transition coming out of this lifequake is going to be different from mine, different from your children, from my children, from our spouses, and from anybody listening to us. We each have to choose the way we're going to change. But I think because we're all, for the first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, I think you could reasonably believe, and most people clung to the idea that we're going back. No one can cling to that anymore. We're not going back. We're going to someplace entirely, we don't know where. And that's going to, the second wave, I think we're now at the point where we're beginning to realize, CDC and the WHO have recently said this, implied this, I would say, that the mental health and personal and identity impact of COVID is going to prove to be greater even than the economic and the medical one.
So the fact that in now more than ever we have freedom in constructing our stories is in a certain sense the flip side of the fact that now more than ever we have to construct it. In other words, I mean, if you look at some of the things about our environment that make lifequakes, in your view, more common maybe than they would have been 70, 80 years ago, those are also liberating things in a certain sense. I mean, just to take one example, you look at the internet, social media. It is in one sense disruptive. And it may give, it could afflict me with traumas that I have to deal with, and be a disruptor. And that's probably true. On the other hand, it's a realm in which I'm free to, I don't mean not reinvent myself, but create a new version of me in a way that wasn't possible 50 years ago.
So I think I think an analogy can be helpful to this part of the conversation, right? And that is that some people are born into lifequakes. If you have a broken family, if you have an addiction of some kind in your family, some people have lifequakes in their teenage years when they lose a parent, or they move, or they migrate countries, as a lot of people I talked to did. You can have lifequakes all through your life. Obviously, I call this the whenever life crisis, the midlife crisis model we have to dismiss. If you are between 39 and 45 in 2020, you're having a midlife crisis. But if you're between 29 and 34, you're also having a crisis, or everybody's having a crisis at the same time. But what I was saying was that, so I want to kind of remind and put back on the table something that we've kind of brushed past, which is the idea that these lifequakes take on average 5 years to get through. And I want to use as an example college. So what college is, for most people who go to college, is kind of the first collective voluntary lifequake that they go through. Okay. What are the phases? And that leads to a life transition. Okay. So what does the transition involve? The long goodbye, where you say goodbye to your old self. We know that's part of going to college, right? Which is that you go and you have to shed that previous identity where you're taken care of by your parents and everything is, kind of given to you. Then there's the messy middle where you give up certain habits and you experiment with new selves and new parts of yourself. And then there's the new beginning where you come out and you unveil your new self. So I've said that the average length is 4 or 5 years. Lo and behold, what is college? It's 4 or 5 years. Okay. And that's a great analogy and exactly the time frame and something that everybody can understand. Cut to today, right? And so you said that we all have this experience, the opportunity, but one of the problems with social media is that you're doing it all the time. Mm-hmm. Think back to when you were in college. Would you have wanted to document every one of these phases? Would you have wanted to be updating it all of the time? No. That's part of the problem, is that we are doing it out loud and leaving this permanent record. And the permanent record, once you write it down, whether you're writing it on Instagram or Snapchat or, TikTok or Instagram story or whatever it might be, once you write it, that becomes part of the process and you're kind of somewhat constrained by this whole thing. And so what I want to say is that the process is messy and we are doing it in public, which makes it a lot harder, but it is simply just going to take a long time. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. And that's a healthy part of the process.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good note to leave people with. Is there anything else you want to say that you think we've left out?
Well,
aside from buy this book, I'll say that. Buy this book.
Well, I appreciate that, and reach out to me. You can find me on all those social medias, and tweet
right.
at me.
What is your Twitter handle?
It's Bruce Feiler, BruceFeiler, and I'm on, all of them, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. You can send me questions or complain or push back or tell me what stories or what ideas resonate most of all. Well, since we have been a bit in this downer place at the end, I'll end, dare I say it, on an upbeat note, and I'll say transitions work. That's what I want to say. 90% of the people I talked to said they got through their lifequake and their life transition. And so that's why this book is called Life is in the Transitions. Again, back to this idea of reviving an old idea. That's something that William James said a century ago. Life is in the transitions, even more than the terms connected. As long as we're going to go through these lifequakes 3 to 5 times in our lives, and as long as they're going to take 4 or 5 years, we have to get over this idea that we have to sort of grit and grind and kind of grovel our way through. We need to see them as what they are, which is opportunities for renewal and growth if you go through the process. So what I want to say is, whatever you're going through, I may have been there, but more importantly, I found someone who's been there. I mean, you've alluded to this several times. I mean, you're going to see people in this book who've been through far worse, I believe, than you've been through. And they're not just going to give you inspiration in kind of an empty way. They're going to give you actual practical tools that you can do tonight or tomorrow or next week that'll help you get through this, so that whatever you're struggling through and whatever life transition you're in right now, we can make them go better and a lot more effectively.
And I can add that you speak from experience. I mean, your lifequake was, I visited you when you were, undergoing chemotherapy. That was serious, that was a serious time, and you, were very impressive, in your emergence from all that. So congratulations on the success of the book.
Thank you.
Life is in the Transitions, Mastering Change at Any Age. We will see you down the road, Bruce.
That echoes the point I made at the beginning, that you're a good friend, and having me here is just part of that. So see you soon, and thank you very much.
Okay, we will see you.